is the next event? 11. Oh, okay. No, not a problem. Mapa to give you the
All right, I think ready to start when you are.
Okay, thank you. Good day, everybody. It's good morning in some parts of the world and good afternoon in other parts of the world. And I'd like to welcome you very much to this session, which is the role of academies of science in climate change policy actions. Academies form a very important role in science in that they usually are the bodies which collate a large amount of information, come to a consensus, and then disseminate it to the people that need to know. Usually the dissemination takes place to governments and government agencies, so they are often the voice of rigorous science, but trying to find a way in which that science can be understood and interpreted by the many stakeholders that wish to use that science. So there are academies all over the world. Some are very ancient and some are very new. But I think they all try and achieve rigorous science, but making sure that that rigorous science is always communicated in a way in which it's understood. So I would like to welcome my panel today and thank them all for being available. And we are going to talk to you about the science advocacy, specifically about climate change and the impacts in different parts of the world. We have people here from the developing world, the non-developing or the underdeveloping world or the third world, and all the different names that people tend to call the Southern Hemisphere often. And very often the quality of science across all of those parts of the world is as good as in any other part of the world. So I think it's very important that we recognize that. So welcome to our colleagues in Glasgow who have joined, and to everybody else on this panel. I will introduce each of the speakers as we go along, but I would first like to introduce one of the people who was responsible for putting this event together, and that's Professor Himlal Sudiel, who is the Executive Officer of the African Academy of Sciences. And she is a South African geneticist, and she has been involved in finding some of the oldest human genetic lines, mainly focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. Before I hand over to Himla, I would just like to say that I was asked to chair this academy because I am a professor of systems analysis at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I'm also a member of the South African Academy of Science Council. So with that, over to you, Himla.
Greetings, colleagues, and thank you, Chairperson, Professor Mary Scholes. Colleagues, I want to firstly welcome our panelists who rose to the occasion when requested to speak in this particular event. ASAF, the Academy of Science of South Africa, is a national academy. We've been in business since our inauguration in 1996 and the late President Nelson Mandela was our chief supporter. And over the years, as Professor Scholes has mentioned, ASAF, the National Academy in South Africa, has been responsible for several studies, including issues related to climate change. And this year, we have published our second report on climate-related issues, and my colleague will share the link to that for your perusal at your leisure. But I do not want to steal the thunder of my speakers. As Professor Scholes has mentioned, we have taken this opportunity to break all the borders, because when we're dealing with climate change, boundaries have no place in this. And so we have invited some star-cast scholars from South Africa to present, and the chair will introduce them, and you will see why they have been so sought after to speak, not only in this event, but across the COP26 events currently ongoing. And we are also pleased that we have colleagues from academies on the African continent and partners from the international representation. And in essence, the significance of this event is for us to bring our scholarship and experiences together, for us to rise to the occasion, as we've been hearing, coming out from ongoing programs at the COP26, about why there is a need for us to address this challenge. And so colleagues, brace yourself for an energetic and most amazing star cast of presentations. And Chair, without further ado, I will hand back to you and say welcome to all our participants across the globe who are participating either live in Glasgow, online, or on our YouTube coverage. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Himla. I would also like to welcome, I see we now have 57 participants online, as well as the people in the pavilion in Glasgow. It's wonderful to see such a huge turnout and for people to be interested in this particular topic as to how academies can play a role in making sure that the science is communicated to a wide range of stakeholders. So I would like you all very much to use the Q&A function on this webinar, more so than the chat. The Q&A is easier in that you are able to write in your questions and we are able to give you written answers to those questions or verbal answers, depending on how the time allows. So the way we have structured this afternoon is that there are a number of scientific presentations, and then we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentations. So having said that, as in all science, there is some degree of uncertainty because people are having to rush off to some meetings and come back in again and leave again and go again. So in order to accommodate those people, for example, Francois Engelbrecht will be our first speaker today, and he will then have to leave, as will our second speaker, to attend other IPCC events, but they hope to join us later in the afternoon for the Q&A. But just to make sure that we do have your questions captured, both the first speaker and the second speaker will speak for a shorter amount of time, allowing you to ask your questions of them during their talk in case they don't get to come back later in the afternoon. So having said that, I hope it's clear. And now I would like to move on to our first speaker of the afternoon. That is Professor Francois Engelbrecht. And he will be talking on climate change and risks for Southern Africa. He's from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He is one of South Africa's preeminent climatologists, and he's a distinguished professor of climatology at the Global Change Institute of the University of the Witwatersrand. So over to you, Francois.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you, Professor Sudial, for this opportunity. What a great privilege it is to talk at the ASAF event at COP26. And good day from my side to all the online participants and also to the delegates in Glasgow. It's wonderful to get a peek of how it looks like there at the actual COP26 event. So I'll have to talk rather quickly, more or less 12 minutes or so, to leave a little bit of time for questions, as Prof Scholes just indicated. And my talk will be about climate change and the risks that it brings to the Southern African region. So this is very much in the spirit of the event. Another opportunity for me as one of the IPCC Assessment Report 6 authors to share with you some of the critical findings of the report, in this case, critical to the African continent. Of course, always in the hope that awareness will eventually lead to climate action. And I mean, you are witnessing there, those are members of the audience in Glasgow, of course, the extent to which science is being converted into action. So I think we all now know how the IPCC assessment report was referred to by the United Nations Secretary General, a code red for humanity. My talk today is about explaining why this is also the case for the Southern African region. At the time when this report was released, of course, there were a number of extreme events, unprecedented in nature, occurring around the world. For example, the unprecedented heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, and then record-breaking flooding in Western Germany, July this year. The terrible flooding in California and the Mediterranean in August this year. And right now, in the part of the world I'm from, a devastating drought in southern Madagascar that just doesn't want to break. It's now the 4 years of drought in a row. We hope the coming summer will break that drought. There's famine in the southern parts of Madagascar. These extreme weather events are increasingly being attributed to climate change. I also refer to that in my talk and try to bring that message of increasing occurrences of extreme events home for the Southern African region. Let's look at some of the key findings of the report that are important globally. Firstly, we need to realize that global warming has now reached a value of 1.1 degrees Celsius. That was one of the key findings of the Assessment Report 6 Working Group 1 report. And of course, that means we are so close now towards exceeding the thresholds of global warming that can be considered dangerous, namely 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. Another reason why this report was called the Code Red for Humanity is because the report made another startling assessment. It is probably too late for us. It's more likely than not, that's the language the report uses, that we will exceed a 1.5 degrees Celsius level of global warming, even if we do everything right. So what do I mean with that? I'm referring to a so-called best effort mitigation. So on this graph, a very well-known graph, of course, in the IPCC context, on the y-axis here, we are looking at the level of the global warming over time. Here we can see the different mitigation scenarios for which the level of global warming evolves as a function of over time. So a best effort mitigation means we are cutting emissions in half by 2030. That's, of course, the big topic of discussion at the COP. Then we achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Even if we do that, it's more likely than not that we will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. And that exceedance is in the near future. The best estimate we have for that is the early 2030s. Of course, the other side of the coin is unmitigated climate change, a fossil fuel future. In that case, global warming reaches devastating levels of close to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So this graph is important to show a few other important global aspects of climate change. Top left is the graphic I've just discussed. Top right shows that precipitation is projected to increase on the average over the world's land masses. Bottom left shows that under low mitigation futures, we will lose the precious ecosystem of Arctic sea ice by the middle of the century. And bottom right, under low mitigation climate change futures, sea level rise may approach a level of 1 meter towards the end of the century. Under strong mitigation, we can reduce that to less than half a meter. Now, 1 meter of sea level rise is, of course, sufficient to displace hundreds of millions of people from where they currently live in the world's low-lying area. So global tipping points are important. We are now heading towards a point where we may trigger the irreversible melting of the Greenland ice sheet and the Western Arctic ice sheet. The report finds that the critical threshold, the global tipping point where this irreversible melting may start, may in fact be between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. It may actually be at 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the moment these ice sheets start to melt in an irreversible way, we are, of course, committing future generations to 12 meters of sea level rise. Now, it will take millennia for those two massive ice sheets to melt away completely. The estimate is that 2 degrees of sustained warming will bring sea level rise of about 6 meters over 2,000 years. But it means we are effectively committing future generations to a planet that is smaller than today's planet, less living space. And as I've mentioned, in our own lifetime, it also means hundreds of millions of people being displaced by sea level rise of about 1 meter. So what about our region, Southern Africa? And what about Africa? And the report goes to great length to describe the projected climate change signal for various regions in the world. This is one example. We are looking here at regional changes in temperature as a function of the level of global warming. So top left, you can see that at that point in time, when the world has warmed by 1.5 degrees Celsius in climate model projections, the Arctic is that part of the world that would have warmed the most. That's of course because of positive feedback processes that set into motion when sea ice starts melting. But have a look at the Southern Hemisphere. We find the largest rate of temperature increase in the Southern African interior, specifically in Botswana, and that is something we can already observe. It's happening already. So in the interior parts of Southern Africa, the observed rate of warming is about twice the global rate of warming. You can see that by the time that the world reaches a level of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius of global warming, the regional temperature change in Southern Africa can only be described as devastating. It is in the order of 6 degrees Celsius. And back in 2018, the IPCC found in its special report that would imply the collapse of the maize crop, the staple food in Southern Africa, as well as of the cattle industry. Also because the region is projected to become generally drier at the same time. That's a trend the latest report from IPCC says can already be detected. And as the level of global warming increases, that general drying strengthens. And the region is also projected to experience more frequent droughts. And that is why the Southern African region is regarded as a climate change hotspot. When a region that is already water stressed, as all Southern Africans will know, becomes drastically warmer and drier, then the options that we have for adaptation are limited. We have a very good idea of what is causing all these changes. The report goes to great length to explain, for example, these projected changes in rainfall over Southern Africa. Here's an example. The winter rainfall is already decreasing and is projected to continue to decrease because of the fact that in a warmer world, the westerly winds are being shifted towards the South Pole. And with them, the cold fronts that bring our winter rainfall to South Africa are shifted towards the South Pole. So the dynamics of climate change is nowadays so well understood. And that helps us, of course, to have confidence in the projections. So now I'd like to conclude with 2 slides. In the first slide, I'd like to point out what I think are a critical set of risks for Southern Africa as we move into the future. We refer to these as regional tipping points. Events that may occur in the Southern African climate system that have never occurred before, unprecedented, and that will have impact of a magnitude unknown to those of us currently living in the region. In a regional climate system that is, or in a regional system that is already water stressed and will experience more frequent droughts, also multi-year droughts into the future, is of course a climate system that brings the risk of so-called day zero drought in the big cities. We almost had such a drought in the city of Cape Town, 2015 to 17, the city came close to running out of water. But this latest report from IPCC is suggesting that this risk may also exist in South Africa's economic heartland, the Gauteng province. And that, I think, is the single biggest risk that South Africa faces from climate change in the next 10 years and the next 20 years because of the devastating economic impact such a drought will have. Multi-year droughts, of course, are often associated also with heat waves. That impacts on the maize crop and the cattle industry. The tipping point, if we just look at the biophysical impacts, is at 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. That is where these industries may collapse in the Southern African region. But I think if we also take into account socioeconomic aspects of farming, how many multi-year droughts can a subsistence farmer live through? I think if we start to do that calculation, we will find that this tipping point may be at 2.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, maybe at 2. The third point there, the report is clear. In the next 10 to 20 years, we will experience heat waves of unprecedented intensity in Southern Africa. Millions of our people live in informal settlements. They don't have air conditioning. They don't have access to cool water. If you're an elderly person and you don't have access to cool water and your living space don't have air conditioning, it's life-threatening. Finally, a completely different type of risks. Never before in Southern Africa's history did we have a category 4 or 5 hurricane or intense tropical cyclone making landfall as far south as Maputo, southern Mozambique, or Richards Bay in South Africa. Now, if we look at the findings of the report, for the very first time, it's possible that these systems may travel that far to the south because of higher sea surface temperatures in the Mozambique Channel. So my very last slide to conclude. Should all these risks leave us with feelings of despair? It can easily do that. I think, though, there are two positive aspects. Firstly, the level of global warming, as we are meeting here today, is still in the hands of humans. The decisions are being made right now in Glasgow. And the worst impacts of climate change can still be avoided. The second positive aspect is climate science gives us a grip on these risks we will likely encounter over the next 10 to 20 years. Remember, we are committed to further warming, so there will be further impacts. We have a good idea of what they are. That gives us an opportunity to adapt, at least to some extent, to these changes. Now, our next speaker, my colleague Prof Midgley, will talk about adaptation in much more detail. I think I've managed to leave 2 minutes for questions. Back to you, Mary. I hope we can have a question or two. I can't hear you, Mary.
Thank you very much. At the moment, there are no questions. Unless there is anybody on our panel who would like, I don't see any hands at the moment. Are there any people in the audience that would like to raise a question? If we can monitor those. So I think at the moment there are no questions, but I'm sure as the session heats up and we move along, people will get to think about what the particular issues are. I would like to thank you very much, Francois, for taking the time to be with us. One question has quickly popped up.
Sure, thanks, Mary.
So it comes from Egil Gledhill. What elements of government policy are needed in South Africa?
Well, that's, of course, a very, very far-reaching question and answer. So we do need government to take action in terms of, for a start, climate change adaptation, literally across all the spheres of government. Of governance. For example, in municipalities, there are very clear risks in so many South African municipalities in the eastern parts of the country, for example, people are still living below flood lines. It's very clear that in the east, there will be more extreme rainfall events. We are not prepared for those events, increasing in intensity. We don't have a disaster risk reduction plan for a tropical cyclone of great intensity, making landfall at Richards Bay in South Africa. We don't have a transparent disaster risk reduction plan in place for the possibility of the Gauteng province running out of water, or its supply from the eastern mega dams being severely compromised for 2 or 3 years in a row. So there's so much to do, and you can see the interventions required stretch from the municipal level all the way through to interventions that national government can make. Then we are, of course, not even talking yet about mitigation. That's a completely different topic, and we actually saw important progress for South Africa over the last few days in that regard. But thank you for a very challenging question.
Thank you very much, Francois. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and if possible, could you possibly join us later? So
thank you, Mary. I should be able to do that.
Thank you. So if I may now move on to Professor Guy Midgley. So Professor Guy Midgley is another colleague of mine in South Africa. He is going to talk about risks and opportunities in adaptation and mitigation for Africa. Professor Guy Midgley is a leading expert in the field of biodiversity and global change science, and he is based at the School of Climate Studies at Stellenbosch University and is listed on the Reuters hot list of the top 1,000 most influential climate change scientists in the world. So thank you very much, and over to you, Guy.
Hello, Mary. Thanks very much. I'm just trying to find, yes, my video. Yeah, there we go. Thanks very much. And thanks also to ASA for this wonderful opportunity. Francois has given you a really brilliant look at the impacts of climate change on the African region. And I'm going to be talking about the impacts, the risks and opportunities from our mitigation and adaptation responses. So that relates to the question that Francois got. And I'm going to really attempt to highlight some issues that are critical, but maybe less well known, and that relate to ecosystems, land use, and land use change. But I will also look at the energy issues very, very briefly as well. I don't have a lot of time. So let's get going. If I can try and get my, yes, there we go. What this is about really is the two main responses that we have available. And there is a relationship between them. Firstly, mitigation will allow us to reduce the impacts of climate change on the global climate. So they tend to bring down the future trajectory of temperatures, as shown by the graph on the left, which is the IPCC graph. But we need adaptation to allow us to cope with the unavoidable impacts of what's left over. We cannot mitigate perfectly. So there's a relationship between these two things. The better we mitigate, the less we have to adapt. We also know much better how to mitigate. We know much less well how to adapt. And there's a lot of wishful thinking, I think, in the area of adaptation. There's a lot of science that still needs to be done. So this is really critical, especially for Africa. Now, the opportunities in Africa for mitigation, which is switching really to a more renewable energy grid, are really a no-brainer. This region already is one of the best regions in terms of the proportion of electricity generated from renewable sources, at the moment mainly from hydroelectricity. But our solar and wind resources are virtually untapped and could be a massive, absolutely massive bonus for this part of the world. So there's really not a lot of subtlety here. This is a massive opportunity that we are waiting to grab. This is the COP in which real progress has been made. South Africa has been offered a deal, 140 billion rand to help push us in this direction, achieve a just transition, and this can be a benefit to the whole region. So I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time on this. In fact, this is my last slide. I just wanted to highlight this fairly recent study, which showed how by 2030, as early as 2030, the sub-Saharan African region could be on a 100% renewable grid. And it's cost effective. We used hydro as pumped storage, renewables in different ways. And with enough ambition, this region could be on that pathway with all the health benefits that result and all the jobs benefits that result. It's an extraordinary opportunity, and we should not let it slip, and hopefully South Africa will jump on what they've been offered. But I really want to talk about what I think is underappreciated, the most underappreciated mitigation response so far. And I want to illustrate it very quickly with this slightly technical figure. But what this figure shows is where our CO2 concentration was in 1870, just after we learned how to burn coal to make an industrial revolution. and where we are now, well, where we were in 2014, as recently as 2014, we were still under 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we went from 288 to 397 ppm. But what's underappreciated is that we really emitted something close to 260 parts per million equivalent of CO2. In other words, a massive amount of mitigation was happening. Where was this happening? This is hugely underappreciated, I think. So where is the missing carbon? Well, it ends up in our natural ecosystems. Roughly half of that missing carbon has been absorbed into the oceans, causing acidification. And the other half, roughly, has been absorbed onto the land surface. So this is by far the biggest mitigation that has occurred. Nobody's paid for it. It's been free, and it's had some adverse impacts in our ecosystems. And we had better protect it if we are to stay below the 2 degree mark and hopefully reach 1.5 degrees. So this is critical, and it's critical for Africa because land systems in Africa are under some risk of fast development, which could really damage these sorts of sinks. All right, where are these sinks? Despite the fact that these are vast, we know relatively little about where they are, and it's extraordinary. These are 3 different modeled constructions of where these sinks might be using different approaches. The sinks where the carbon is being stored on land are given in red, and the sources are given in blue, where ecosystems may be blowing off carbon. And you can see that these 3 different approaches give 3 very different answers. This one says it's all in tropical forests. There's a bunch in China, and in these mid-latitude, these temperate latitudes. This one says a lot in tropical Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa, and in this part of South America. You can see it's a mess. We are urgently in need of better ecosystem science that can help us refine where these things are. They're the most important mitigation response by far. We don't even know where they're happening, and we need to know in order to defend and protect the systems that are doing this work for us. We need to pay the countries who protect those ecosystems. We need to compensate them for that, if indeed they need compensation to protect them. And this set of graphs on the right here shows you what is driving the sinks. It turns out that it seems to be rising CO2, which is fertilizing the growth of plants. And that's a really important component of these sinks. And that, if we can confirm that, that tells us a heck of a lot about what we need to do. What might this sort of response look like in Africa? Well, we think that in Africa, the CO2 fertilization effect driving these sinks are causing very substantive changes in the structure of sub-Saharan African ecosystems. And in South Africa, we see here a phenomenon known as bush encroachment, which is an encroachment of woody plants, trees and shrubs into previously open ecosystems, grassland ecosystems. And it's occurring very broadly in South Africa. It's occurring broadly across the region. Namibia even claims this as an offset against its local emissions, resulting in Namibia being a net sink for carbon. What does it look like when this happens? Well, here is a series of 3 photographs taken from the 1920s, the 1950s and 60s, and through to a recent decade. This is published in a paper we published fairly recently in Nature Climate Change. And it shows what an open ecosystem looks like when it is converted into a carbon storing, woody dominated system. And there are vast impacts on biodiversity, on ecosystem structure, on hydrology. We urgently need to understand this as Africans because this is a huge issue for us. So we as Africans need to be interested in how our natural ecosystems are responding. And in South Africa and in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, we're investing substantively in the kind of technology that can monitor the life force of our ecosystems, their water use and their carbon sequestration. And these networks have been built in South Africa and across the region, and this is going to be a critical component of the science that will help us move towards a sustainable future. There's another underappreciated fact. This is the most underappreciated adaptation response by far, by natural ecosystems again. If you look across the world, there is abundant evidence of species and ecosystems adapting naturally to climate change. And there's another area. We need to understand how this is happening, what are the implications for our ecosystems, how to protect this process, and how it contributes to sustaining biodiversity and ecosystem function. Enormously important. We know rather little about it, and we need to find out about it fast. What are the risks of these two responses in Africa? Well, I want to highlight one in particular, and that is the risk of the silver bullet solution. And here I'm referring to a recent set of papers that has come out and has energized hundreds of millions of dollars in potential investment into planting trees across our planet. And while there's no problem in planting the right trees into the right ecosystems and restoring them, there are massive risks to putting the wrong trees in the wrong places, because our open ecosystems in this part of the world provide ecosystem services that are irreplaceable. So here's a map that was produced by a Swiss team showing areas that are ripe for afforestation. They say reforestation, we say afforestation, and it highlights some of the most pristine grasslands in sub-Saharan Africa. These are the grasslands that provide our major cities with water. And Francois talked about day zero. If we planted trees into these systems, we would destroy our hydrological water towers of the Drakensberg. So please, Northern Hemisphere people looking for silver bullets, please engage with Southern African ecologists about these issues before you pour hundreds of millions of dollars into destroying our systems. Please, listen to us. We need to do better science on this issue, and we need to collaborate and cooperate. We stand ready. Read our science even. Just do us a favor reading the papers that we publish. They're not inaccessible to you. So there is massive potential, they say, for reforestation. But we've pointed out clearly that this potential overlaps with indigenous concerns around biodiversity, around our carnivores, around cattle production, which is also sustainable, and around our open ecosystems. We've learned a lot about the risks of inappropriate deforestation. As one of them, I'm just going to give you one. These are pine trees introduced from California, the Monterey pine, escaping like bandits across our open fynbos, highly diverse shrublands in the Southern Cape of South Africa. These pine trees destroy the hydrological supply to the city of Cape Town, and were a contributor towards Cape Town approaching day zero, far closer than we should have. This should never have been allowed to happen, and unfortunately, it's there. This is a warning to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Look upon these reforestation silver bullets with a very cynical eye, and make sure that they make sense, and they make sense ecologically, and they make sense economically. So just to conclude, I think my message is we need greater appreciation for the value of ecosystems as real engines, the biggest engines of adaptation and mitigation. Our nature-based solutions that are much touted across the planet are filled with promise, but not without risk, and we need science to understand them, and African science is ready to do that. We need that fundamental science. It will support critical decisions with respect to ecosystem-based adaptation and mitigation. And please, our African scientists need to be engaged in major decisions about scaling up these nature-based solutions. That's my message. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Guy. I think we have a minute for one very quick question that has come in, and it says, how can South Africa best leverage the new partnerships between the US, the UK, France, and Germany to operationalize mitigation and adaptation actions across the country?
Well, South Africa is ready to do it. We've got, we've got a lot of basic research and policy on mitigation and adaptation. What we need to do is rapidly modernize our electrical energy grid. There are huge advantages for us in that: health advantages, jobs advantages, and global warming advantages. With respect to adaptation, there are a wide range of projects already underway which are trialing ecosystem-based adaptation, are trialing local adaptation responses. Adaptation is a national and local game. Mitigation is more of a national game. It can be local as well. But our region, I think, is ripe for opportunity for trialing and testing out many of these responses, monitoring the effectiveness, and then testing them for scaling up. So I think we're a good investment.
So thank you very much, Guy. I agree with you. We're a very good investment. So thank you for your presentation, and enjoy the next session you need to be at as well. And we look forward to having you back later if you can make it. So thank you very much, Guy. Thank you. So if I may move on to our next speaker now, is Dr. Dheeraj Kuzi. He's an independent epidemiologist offering integrated epidemiological solutions in a variety of contemporary issues, including climate change and health. He is known for his integrated approach to the holistic perspective of health. And if I'm correct, he is from Mauritius. So good afternoon, and thank you very much for being able to join us. Over to you.
Good afternoon, Mary. Good afternoon, everybody. I bring you greetings on whatever time zone you're in. We have seen, let me start to share my screen, see how that works. I think that's working, yeah. Yeah. We have seen the previous two speakers present to us the amount of work that has been done on climate change in Southern Africa. We live in an ecosystem and we're interconnected by the air we breathe, by the water we drink, by the food we eat. There's transboundary pollution and climatic hazards. So we have to take the approach from the country level to the continent to find a unifying concept. My task today is to present to you the report of the NASAC, which is the National Academy of Science, which is the National African Science Academy, and the main findings. Of course, the report contains much more than this. As a continent, Africa is the most vulnerable to climate change and health. Remember, I'm talking about health and climate change. Our vulnerability stems from at least four main fronts. We have a high level of climatic hazards. Our geography is unique, and you saw some of this just now. Our populations are vulnerable, and the health system also vulnerable. Let's take geographical features. We span a lot of different climate, from equatorial to tropical. Our land mass can be arid to semi-arid. And the health system is respond poorly because we are overburdened. Most of the health system is kind of a vertical system with little integration of various components. On these continents, then, we live other people who are living there. And most of our countries in Africa are classed as low middle income countries. So we have low adaptive capacity due to lack of structure and know-how. Let's take an example of climatic hazards, adverse weather condition, rising heat. Rising heat, for instance, is already noticeable from another angle, apart from what the previous author described. The ice cap on the Kilimanjaro is melting. When that melts, that affects the volume of water flowing, affects the agricultural pattern, the way of life of the people are leading, and it will lead to a cascading effect. Actually, all the climatic hazards are interrelated, and the pathways of exposure is very complicated. The interaction of those four vulnerability leaves us with catastrophic result: economic, social, and health. Mostly for health, we get loss of life and livelihood due to surge of climate-sensitive diseases. I missed one, okay. Just to give you a snapshot, according to WHO estimate, we have the highest death from climate change in Africa. We can go as much as 120,000 deaths annually. That is attributable to climate change in Africa, as shown on the map here. On the right-hand side, I show a snapshot of how things happen. Just for the period of 2000 to 2019, heat alone killed close to 250,000 persons, and drought close to 750,000. And there are other effects, as you can see. They're mostly foodborne disease, malnutrition, food security. But of noteworthy interest is that because of climate change, we're changing our food pattern of lack of food, of the right balanced diet. We're getting to high carbohydrate, and it's putting close to 25 million people at increased risk for non-communicable diseases. And the projection is dire for Africa. There will be surge in all climate-sensitive diseases like vector-borne, air pollution, and all that are linked together. Of course, it's difficult to get a handle on the burden of disease accurately, but that gives you a snapshot of how things are moving. Definitely, with that dire prediction, we have to find a way to adapt to climate change and health now. We have to introduce a public health package. In this package, should include the early warning system that will allow us to anticipate, to forecast, and to manage the climatic hazards and the associated diseases. And one of the best ways to include EWAS in our national level is to have it grafted in the nationally determined contribution in the NDC. The map on the left-hand side is the most recent we have. It shows that health is mentioned in most NDCs in Africa. But mentioning health is not enough. We're going to move from word to action. We need to formulate a health adaptation plan, health national adaptation plan. And that's missing in most countries. Why are we missing it? Well, to get such a plan, we have to talk across the sectors. The Ministry of Health will work alone. The Ministry of Environment will work in isolation, and the two do not overlap or collaborate. And the best tool to foster such collaboration is to use the WHO health in all policy approach that will ensure sectoral collaboration. We also look at the access to Green Climate Fund. We find most of Africa, but very few countries, have access to fund. And for health is even less. Why is that so? We definitely have limitation. We have to build capacity. And that's not the only limitation we have. We have other limitations too. There are gaps that we can use to advance the solution. During our report, we identified the three main areas of weakness is database, research, and mitigation. Now, database, we need to have a database of the climatic hazard in time and space. And we need to link that to the diseases also, to the disease burden, to mortality and disease. Then policymakers will have evidence base to formulate a policy. In the absence of such data, people can argue anything they want. They can say climate change is not responsible for health consequences, or they can say it's responsible highly. So we need the database. We also need to do research, as shown by the previous speakers. We have some capacity, not some, we have very excellent capacity. We need to model the co-benefits of mitigation that we have on health. But of course, South Africa is not the whole of Africa. We need to have this kind of capacity throughout our continent. And we have limited capacity in that respect. And we have to partner with established institutions so we can achieve the end. Mitigation, we have to promote alternative technologies. We have to empower the local community. They've been living for centuries on the continent, and they know what they've been adapting to climate change, and they know what works and what doesn't. They need to be empowered so they can take that move further ahead. For instance, you have to pay due respect to the ecosystem. We can explore planting fire-resistant trees, drought-resistant crop, like it's already been done in Nigeria for maize. But it's in our lifestyle, in our diet. Eat less meat and adapt to using stove for cooking to wean off from the coal. Also, we need to promote green space in our urban planning. This was in our report, this answer came from Côte d'Ivoire. So we are left with this. What do we do? Mitigation has co-benefits. It also has cost. We all know that the COVID pandemic has wreaked havoc on our economy and the health system. But it also creates opportunities for us to introduce sustained green technologies. We cannot just sustain the green technology. It requires enormous financial commitment to do that. And we're seeing what's already happening in COP so far, COP26, some of the commitments are being met. Now, we bear the brunt disproportionately in relation to the greenhouse gases we produce. Climate change, we can very well ask, many countries in Africa can ask, shall we focus on adaptation for health protection, or shall we focus on both adaptation and mitigation? Of course, they all have the benefit immediately or in long term, or both now. This mitigation, of course, we should do both. Of course, both are going to help us. But we are unable to do it alone. Climate change, my take-home message, is happening now in Africa. The issue of climate change will not be solved within the boundary of one nation or a continent, or for that matter, a region. It's a global problem that requires global solution. And the capacity for doing that for most of African countries needs to be strengthened. That's my take-home message. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. So we don't have any time now for any follow-up Q&As. There are questions that are coming in, but we will have a Q&A session as we continue to move through the afternoon. So the Q&A session will be at 12:30, depending on which time zone you're in, or at 14:30. So please stay with us for the next 4 talks until we get to the Q&A session. So thank you very much. Please continue to type in your questions into the Q&A box, and we will get around to them at the end of this particular session. May I now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Adubanju. Dr. Adubanju is a public health physician who currently serves as the Executive Secretary of the Nigerian Academy of Sciences, where he leads the Academy's work in science advice. Thank you very much, Dr. Adubanju. Over to you. I think you are still muted.
Thank you. And I'm sorry about that. Yeah. Yes, so sorry about that. Just had a little itch there.
Welcome.
Great. So thank you. So my job today is actually to introduce to you this booklet produced by the academies in Africa. Academies are the peak independent scientific institutions in their countries, and they meet under the umbrella. We've heard Diraj talking about NASAC. We meet under the umbrella of NASAC as a network, and produce joint statements and booklets, on pertinent topics that affect the continent. So one of such statements is this booklet titled Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience in Africa, Recommendations to Policy Makers. And my job is to give you a glimpse, of a booklet. And hopefully you go download that off the NASAC website, nasaconline.org, and you can read in further details. But primarily, let me say first that the academies have been speaking on important topics such as climate change. And I recall particularly also a statement at the annual meeting of the African Academies in 2012 in Lagos, Nigeria, where they produced a statement on climate change, which went global. But particularly this booklet we're talking about now speaks to African governments about key areas and particularly about adaptation and resilience in those areas. So it talks about assessing the status, or it covers an assessment of the status of climate change in Africa, makes recommendations for climate change adaptation and resilience, and also why climate change adaptation and resilience is crucial, for Africa. And I think we've heard some of that today, and how to address climate change impact through targeted policies and interventions. And that's the real crux of the matter. And I'll just run through very quickly some of those things. So looking at the sector of water, it emphasizes the sensitivity, of Africa in particular to the impact of climate change where water is concerned, and recommends that there needs to be a consideration for water quantity and quality approaches. So we need to integrate the thinking, not just for quantity, but quality. How do you maximize that in the light of climate change? How do you strengthen water research, or rather we need to strengthen water research and improve hydroclimatic monitoring. Also the need to improve understanding of the impact of climate change on oceans. And lastly, where water is concerned, to improve the communication of research findings, even in particular to local communities. So they need to understand what is going on, what the findings are. We need to connect research to policy and practice. Talking about agriculture and food security, again, there's need to promote linkages between farmers and researchers. So we need to break down the walls between those who practice and those who research, and ensure that research is informing policy and practice. Secondly, livelihood diversification plus crop and livestock insurance needs to be explored even further. We should push for shifts from subsistence farming alone to selling. So farmers need to start looking at cash crops and other types of crops to improve the cash reserves, so that when they are badly hit by droughts and whatnot, they have other options. They have cash to invest in other things as well. And lastly, there's need for improved weather observation and early warning systems. The booklet also talks about fisheries and food security in general, and it emphasizes the need to improve daily and seasonal forecasts, the need to intensify the research on improvement and diversification of livelihoods, improve production systems use inputs efficiently, ensure there's less variability, and ensure that the systems are more resilient to shocks. And just like for agriculture, also there's need for extension services. They become even more important now. And lastly, we need to start looking at sustainable fisheries management in terms of catch quotas, and of course that has to be well established and also well legislated and enforced. So for coastal and urban zones, the booklet emphasizes the areas of rich economic resources. That is what Africa is. The coastal and urban zones are areas of rich economic resources. And of course, you have therefore increasing urbanization, but definitely that also makes them vulnerable to climate change. So there's need therefore for protection measures, resilient infrastructure there, marine spatial planning, and so on. And one of the recommendations is also to have a lot of partnership with the private sector. And I know that in Lagos, for instance, there's a lot of private sector work at the coastal zones. We have an Eco-Atlantic City project. That's a government, but largely driven by the private sector, where they have a technology, the funding also to implement certain infrastructure that protects the coastal area. And lastly, the need to develop blue economy, which is ensure landing berths, buy fishing ships, etc. And human health, I think the right judge just did a lot of justice to that. But the recommendations in the booklet, in particular, are about strengthening national health systems. So if you will adapt to the impact of climate change with the change in disease patterns and whatnot, there's need to strengthen the national health systems. Also, there's need to improve infrastructure related to water and sanitation. So we can't think of health within the Ministry of Health alone, but we must think about the other sectors, and infrastructure for water and sanitation is particularly key. Thirdly, there's need to increase research into existing and potential diseases, and definitely develop African pharmacopoeia. There's a lot of biodiversity. There's a lot of indigenous knowledge about drugs, about herbs. We need to pay a lot more attention to that and research that and develop that. And second to last is train and retain human resources for health on the continent. And lastly, the need to develop effective health insurance. So that gives us a quick overview of the booklet. And again, I encourage you to go to NASAC's website. And in the words of Nollywood advertisement, which is the Nigerian film industry, we usually would say, grab your copy now. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Dr. Obubanjo. The link to the book has been put up on the chat group, and I think quite a lot of people will be grabbing their copy now. I think one of the sad things about us not all being in Glasgow is that we can't go around from booth to booth and pick up all those wonderful booklets and pamphlets and get a T-shirt and a pen and all those happy things that make international conferences partially worthwhile, but most importantly is not being able to stop somebody in the passage and have a really good chat. But I thank you very much for you presenting what was in that booklet this afternoon. And I think there will probably now be widespread uptake across the world. So thank you very much. So please stay on the line because we are getting some questions coming in for the Q&A later in the afternoon. So my next speaker this afternoon is Dr. Jackie Cardo. And Dr. Jackie Cardo is the Executive Director of the Network of the African Science Academies. She's based in Nairobi, Kenya, and she's very passionate about project management, especially associated that with policy advice. So over to you. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you very much, Mary. And thank you, my colleagues who've spoken before, because they make my task easy, because my job today is to try and highlight what we see as the role of national science academies in addressing climate change issues. By way of introduction, I think I want to say a few words about the network. I don't know why my slides are not mouth. Oh, so both Dioraj and Doyin talking about the network being a consortium of science academies in the continent. Our main task really is to try and provide authoritative science advice for policy formulation, targeting development aspects in the continent. So far, I think as a network, we try not just to strengthen the value that academies bring on board when they're discussing thematic issues, relevant issues to the continent, like the one we're discussing today, which is climate change specifically, but also to ensure that collectively as a network, we are able to tackle what we see as pertinent issues either through producing relevant science reports or producing policy briefs, and Doreen has just highlighted, or a report like the one Dioraj highlighted. But the key idea is to inject the science into our discussion in spaces of policy, of society, and science itself. Now, our unique niche as a network is simply to provide spaces where scientists in academies in countries where do not have academies can see the value and start some, but then where there are existing academies, to strengthen those to be able to fulfill their mandate and contribute both regionally and globally into what science academies do best, starting from convening, ending up with communicating thematic issues. We also provide an independent platform for credible advice, because simply said, science can only function well when the platform is transdisciplinary and speaks to different stakeholders. So our mandate as a network is to provide that platform as well. And then also to be the voice of science in the continent. And I'm happy here to report that within the network, which serves the African continent, we are the affiliate network for the Inter-Academy Partnership, which is now the global umbrella body for science academies. Now, specifically to our issue of climate change and delving into the topic of what is the role of science academies, I think I've highlighted, and you've seen the details with which both Dioraj and Doreen have highlighted some of the reports we produce. But how are those reports produced? Essentially, we get the best minds in the continent, put them together in what we call a working group, and then have them give their opinions, their research experience, case studies where possible, to inform what the content of that document would look like. The collective nature of how this is done ensures that we get both buy-in at national level from national academies, but also because we include policymakers in the process of developing this output, then we're able to also get their concerns, their issues, and therefore make the reports or the policy booklets or the statements very relevant and timely to their needs. So besides our publication on food nutrition security, climate change adaptation and resilience that you looked at, and then we've also had some in water as well, changing disease patterns, and also agricultural biotechnology. And now what we're working on is the link between climate change and health. So these outputs are not for just gathering dust in the shelves of either policymakers or sectors of societies that use them, but we try to organize communication events and workshops or conferences around this theme for which distance can be furthered up around the recommendations. Now, what then is the value, especially when academies attempt to tackle climate change? I think we just heard from the previous speaker that climate change as it is not an individual issue. It is not a national issue, definitely not a continental issue, but a global issue. Therefore means that we have to have all hands on deck. So it starts by acknowledging that global environmental change is real, and therefore our continent has to either adapt or mitigate. There is no saying that because we don't contribute to the climate change issues, we are therefore not affected. No, everyone actually gets affected. And just like we've tackled many global issues, and I think the recent COVID pandemic is one such scenario where everybody has to work together to overcome universally accepted challenge. This is the same thing that we have to do with climate change, is get all hands on deck and foster both adaptation and mitigation. But then also in disaster risk reduction and management, and I think Diora has mentioned a lot of that. In talking about early warning systems, sometimes it is actually better to prevent than to cure. And that is something that all our scientists and all our working groups in any different thematic areas we tackle seem to highlight, that we need to put a lot of focus in getting early warning systems in place. And I think Diora tackled that a little bit when he's talking about the knowledge gaps that comes with lack of data or the infrastructure or the technical know-how to be able to mitigate or act appropriately when these challenges come. but then also to ensure that we take a holistic approach, a transdisciplinary approach, as well as to ensure that we address all sustainable issues together. Because one SDG affects the rest of it. So it's a collective 7, and therefore our actions have to be cross-cutting. But then we constantly forget, when we are so engrossed in tackling the issue, that we need to constantly at the back of our mind remember that our focus has to be gender equity as well as prosperity. And I say prosperity because sometimes it is not enough just to talk about poverty alleviation and poverty eradication, but it is important for us to talk about prosperity as well. And this is where the entrepreneurial skills in making the sorting out of what the challenges we get from climate change can be attractive and act as a motivator to all parties concerned. But then the guiding principles, I think, in what science academies do in tackling climate change is to ensure that there's a lot of openness around the discussion of what the culture, what is the indigenous knowledge, what is the international community saying, what opportunities do exist, not just for the continent, but globally, because more by and by, we are literally enforcing a workforce that is global. And I think technology has enabled us to do that. The inclusive nature of it, and I think not just gender, geographical issues have to be taken into account, but also language, which is also something that sometimes can get into the way of showing what value academies can bring. And it has to be done in the spirit of collaboration and partnership. So what then is our role as science academies? I think it's threefold. One is science for science. We have to recognize that scientists in the continent are really doing good work that is not only world-class in nature, but also relevant into what we want to do in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And I think our speaker, earlier speaker, I think his name is Guy, indicated that sometimes it's not a cut and paste sort of solution, but you have to delve into the science behind whatever adaptive or mitigating issues that we want to propagate. And therefore, academies' role is to ensure that science actually serves the purpose for science. This is where we need the publications that he referred to be able to write in index and global journals, but essentially do science for the sake of science. And there's no boundary to what science can look at in terms of topics. But then to be able to articulate that, translate the science, and I think Doreen mentioned of translating policy into practice, to be able to be the voice of science and be value that science has in uplifting our society as a whole. So the promotion of science for science is something that academies also do very well. And it's actually one of the fortes that we try to encourage as a network, to do science that is relevant for societal well-being. But then last but not least is science for policy. Our interaction, our collaboration, our partnership with policymakers is not just for agenda setting purposes, but also when we formulate policies, we also see them through to implementation. I mean, most African governments are known for good policies is usually wanting. So to try and get the science academies to not just highlight the
So thank you. I'm not sure if we've just lost Jackie. We seem to have had a little blip in the presentation.
Sorry.
Jackie,
Mary,
are you back again? Yes, you need to finish up in the next 30 seconds, please.
Good. Okay, good. So let me just close by saying, yeah, so science for policy is something that we need to engage in. My network is not very good. Looking at my last slide. Okay, yeah, this is my last slide. The significance that academies have. On to climate change action. One, the convening power. We really need to emphasize that we are able to bring multi-stakeholders onto the discussion table. the communication capacity, because academies are made of memberships. Those memberships are in different capacities within government, within academia, and within society. But then also to be able to do the cost-benefit analysis, where we're able to say, what is the cost of inaction? So I want to stop there, Mary, and just say thank you very much for the opportunity, but conclude takeout. If you don't remember anything else about this presentation, is just to remember that you need to invest in academies. The payoff is huge. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much indeed, Jackie. So please just stay with us. If your network is a little unstable, perhaps you can turn off your video. And there are some questions coming in which we'd like you to address very shortly. But I would now like to introduce the next speaker, who is Dr. Robin Fears. He's the Director of Biosciences Program, the European Academies of the Science Advisory Council, and the Project Coordinator of the Inter-Academy Partnership. He has worked as an advisor to various bodies on issues relating to biomedical science and innovation within the European policy environment. So thank you, Robin. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary, and good afternoon to you all. Let me also thank Asaf for the invitation to speak at this important and wide-ranging meeting. You've already heard about the great work that NASAC is doing in Africa on climate change issues, particularly those appertaining to health. And this health focus fits into a global project organised by the Inter-Academy Partnership, and Jackie has already mentioned IAP, as well as providing, of course, valuable insight into the issues for the African continent itself. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, my task is to tell you a little bit more about the global IAP project on climate change and health. You'll see from this map that essentially IAP, as a global network of more than 140 academies, organizes itself into 4 regional academy networks, including NASAC for Africa. Each of these networks in the current project on climate and health is producing a working group, which will generate a report used to engage with the wider scientific community in that region at national and regional level. But in addition, each of the regional reports, including the NASAC one, feeds into a global synthesis report that will be published early next year and will engage with global audiences as well as regional and national ones. Next slide, please. Okay, and next, please. So this is the current status, the 3 regional reports for Africa and Asia and the Americas, which we hope will be published before the end of the year. The European one is already published. And next slide, please. The global report will be published early next year. It's currently being drafted. Okay, so if you go on to the next slide, please. Of course, many other bodies are also working on the issues for climate change impacts and health. And we have many examples during the current COP26 and indeed the major IPCC reports next year that will follow on from the one we've heard earlier today. How then can academies themselves add value to what's already being done but by others? You heard just now from Jackie about the distinctive features of the African Academy of Sciences that enables it to add value to the conduct and communication of science in Africa. Similar features apply globally. And just very briefly, one of the values of academies is their science-based inclusivity, encompassing many or all of the scientific disciplines, and inclusivity also at the local, regional, and global levels appertaining to science and innovation. In this project, and more generally, we're focusing on solutions, particularly for mitigation and adaptation in response to climate change. And Dheeraj has described some of that activity. And on the basis of those regional activities, we're able to share learning within and between regions in terms of the evidence, good practice for solutions, and at the same time involving and helping to train younger researchers in this area. So next slide, please. The project design is distinctive in its arrangement at the regional level. And in order to deliver outputs that can be mapped onto the shared interests worldwide and generate something meaningful as a resource for global synthesis, clearly it's important to develop common starting points for different regions based on key questions. Let's say our focus is on adaptation and mitigation, with particular reference to vulnerable groups, with particular reference to how we can link local, regional, and global solutions for climate and health. And of course, all that within the broader context of the Sustainable Development Goals, which already provides a very important framework for science and policy. Next slide, please. I've already mentioned that the European report from the global project has already been published and is available on the IAP and ESAC websites. I won't go into a lot of detail on what we found in that report because you can read it for yourselves. But just to mention that the outputs from our European work were one of the resources IAP used to generate the starting points for the project worldwide. It was, of course, part of the initial discussions for the global project that we examined the European outputs to consider how relevant those outputs were to the other regions and to a global synthesis. And essentially the recommendations from the European work fell into 4 categories as listed here: linking research and policy development, communicating the results, the outputs of research to the public as well as policymakers, and particularly to counter misinformation, which has bedeviled some of the discussions on climate change. We emphasize very strongly that, of course, there is a large research agenda for filling knowledge gaps with new research, but that shouldn't be used as a reason to delay acting on the evidence that's already available. It's essential that the issues are urgent. We need to use the evidence that we already have in the context, as Dheeraj has already discussed, health in all policies. It's not just about the health sector. Health is relevant to all policy development on climate change solutions. Next slide, please. I'll just go on briefly to mention a couple of other things. ESAC and IAP earlier this year published a report from a workshop that was led by the Cyprus Institute for the Mediterranean region. And again, you can find this report on our websites. And as part of the Mediterranean region, we included several countries from North Africa: Algeria, Egypt, Sudan, and Tunisia. And I thought I'd say something very briefly about this to kind of complement the focus that you've heard already about Southern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. I won't go into a lot of details because it's already published, but let me just go on to one slide that describes some of the key conclusions from this Mediterranean workshop. And countries in the region agreed that as elsewhere, there are common interests and countries face common challenges in responding to the impacts of climate on health. One of the agreed needs, as Dheeraj mentioned, is the importance of developing resilient and equitable health systems. There are also broad cross-cutting issues for addressing the current fragmentation of research systems. As we've heard, there are research gaps in North Africa as elsewhere. As I mentioned before, it's essential that we act on the evidence already available as well as fill those research gaps. And one point on that context of using the evidence that's already available, this may require using and interpreting evidence from other countries if it's not available in the particular country that we're concerned with. And I think it is an important responsibility for academies to be able to advise policymakers in their own country about the relevance and the appropriateness and the quality of research that's obtained elsewhere and its importance to the local national context. Let me go on to the next slide, please. Okay, in addition to our IAP recent report on North Africa, I wanted just to highlight a couple of topics that emerged from are emerging from the NASAT report that seem to be of particular relevance for sharing with our other regions within the IAP global family. There are, of course, many lessons for good practice in all of our regional reports. I just identify here four. First, there was in the NASAT report, when it's published later this year, you'll see a case study from the Côte d'Ivoire on urban planning, and particularly the increasing importance of green space and green strategies in urban design. And the point I want to emphasize here from this case study is that there is a particular focus on the importance of taking account of local socio-economic factors in urban planning in order to focus on and address the needs of the most vulnerable marginalized populations within the urban space. This varies a lot within many cities, and it is important to focus our solutions on those who are most vulnerable and most marginalized. The second bullet, one for innovation, there is an opportunity in Africa and elsewhere to avoid lock-in to the previous technologies, for example, derived from fossil fuel use, and in order to support new competitiveness and new innovation in energy generation and in energy use. Thirdly, a point that came from our North African work, but also, of course, elsewhere in Africa, the issues are not confined to individual countries. Jackie and Diraj emphasized that. And there are cross-border issues, for example, in dealing with air pollution and in tackling infectious disease threats. In the case of North Africa, that requires coordination with other countries in the Mediterranean, as well as in Africa. And finally, a point that Diraj mentioned, responding to the converging crises of climate change and COVID-19 have been and will be a lot of interactions. One particular point to emphasize in Africa as well elsewhere is the opportunities for sustainable recovery, economic recovery after COVID, and the importance of doing that in a way that brings co-benefits to the environment for health and for equity. It's not just about economic recovery. Many countries have promised a green transformation. It is again a responsibility for academies and others in the scientific community to monitor the implementation of those promises and to hold politicians to account.
Robin, would you please finish up?
Okay. Just to finish, some of our emerging conclusions are already published in this journal, and we can send you the reference to that. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. The work of the academies is not, of course, complete when the report is published. We're all aware of that. In this particular context, academies can add sustained value to the outputs that they are generating at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level. And the global network, I think, has a key responsibility to ensure the voices of those who are often not heard are heard in terms of issues of equity and justice. And just to finish, my most important message to you, or what I think it is the continuing role and responsibility of the scientific community led by the academies to bring robust evidence to the attention of policymakers and indeed to the public at large. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Robin. So if we now may move on to this last speaker before we go into the Q&A. And the speaker is Emma Noren. She's based in Sweden, and she is she's the vice mayor of the Lasekil municipality, and she's a member of the European Committee of the Region since 2020. Her main political focus areas are on international development cooperation, rural development, limnic and marine water issues, fisheries, chemicals and gene technology, hunting and game management. So she certainly crosses from the terrestrial into the marine environment and then into the political agenda. So well done, Emma, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And yeah, you got all my areas of expertise there. Thank you. Well, greetings from Sweden. My name is Emma Noren, as said, and as Madam Chair said, I am located on the west coast of Sweden in a small municipality called Lysekil. And I'm very, very humble and happy to be invited to this great panel of scientists. And I will try to make a little bit more political point of view here. And I was actually a scientist myself and worked at a university and also on a local aquarium here. And I was learning and teaching and doing science about the ocean and the problems we have there. But I used to say that it was the love for the sea that made me, that brought me into politics, because I realized that whatever I say and how much I teach and learn, someone had to do something, and that someone wasn't there. So I had to go into the politics myself. I have served as a member of the National Parliament. And now I'm the vice mayor of this small Lysekil. And as heard, I'm also a member of the European Committee of Regions, and that is an official consultative body representing cities and regions in the policy-making process in the European Union. And that is on that behalf I'm here. And I have also been, due to that, I have been in a network between EU and South Africa on the biodiversity conservation. So I think that's why I'm invited here. But as I said, I would try to make this. Now we have heard all this from the beginning, the horrible numbers we've seen and where we are actually ahead, and we need to stop this. We have to make sure that we will be within the planetary boundaries. And right now we are proceeding far beyond when it comes to climate change, and also many of the other boundaries we have when it comes to loss of biodiversity and so on. So from a political point of view, I will try to see how this fits into our agenda. And the first thing I have to say, it's so important that we have to adopt a science-based, that the policy we make are science-based, and more importantly, that the challenge behind the implementation of the policies actually are science-based. And I think that is my most important message today, that we, and now I'm talking about politicians, we need science to defend the robust principles, to make the right decisions, and to act accordingly to what our citizens need and what they want from us. So the science must be the backbone in the things we do. And we have seen now, when we have the pandemic still going on, and around the globe, we can see that some politicians across the globe, they are not following the recommendations of the scientific communities. And that have also, we can see the horrible things that have happened due to that. And we have actually seen the same when it comes to climate change. For many years, we've witnessed politicians not listening to the warning signals that scientists have shared for so many years. But I think that today we actually are listening to the science and trying to do something. Maybe it's the last minute, but it's actually happening something. And we see a great mobilizations from the citizens, especially the younger ones. I'm a proud Swede with Greta Thunberg. As a Swede, it's making me very proud. And now we see the importance and the improvement of this. But is it enough? An example from here from the European regions, we saw that many of the regional and local authorities, they announced the climate emergency before the European Parliament did. And that may suggest that the local politicians listen to what the scientists say, and that's important, and that sometimes it can go faster and quicker in the local and regional level. However, are the actions followed, and are they science-based? And when you work closely to the citizens that we do here on the local and regional levels, it's hard. I can see here in my hometown we have a oil refinery that wanted to expand last year, and it was really hard to say no for many of us, since it would affect many jobs. But we cannot have something that actually will increase the emissions when we need to lower. And but it was hard because it affects so many people in the daily life, and that's what we work with, the politicians. We need to take all the society into account. If I go back to the Committee of the Regions, as I said, it's a part of the policy making of the European Union, and it's aimed to make sure that the impacts of the European legislation will actually listen to the local and regional authorities, so that is making the legislation is actually valid and works at the local and regional level. And to this end, me and my fellow members, we are all locally and regionally elected politicians. We discuss and adopt official legal documents called opinions. And these opinions, there are policy recommendations on a specific topic to the Commission or to the Parliament. And due to time, I will not take all the examples, but we are very much stressed the importance of science in innovation. For example, when it looks at the data collected from the European space, European space data collected from the European Global Satellite Network, the Galileo, we have stressed out that this information can be used to monitor remote areas. Example, how to determine an area of a forest in a country is protected and restored, or when it have been said it's a carbon sink, so that get carbon credits for it. We see that these images from the Galileo can be used to see how large is it still there, and so on. We have many different corporations. We have the European Joint Research Center, which is a science and knowledge service that employs scientists to carry out research in order to provide independent scientific advice to support the European Union policy. And many other different projects that just try to use the science to make sure that the policy are science-based. And now I would like to stress out some of the make the attention to some of the things that we from the European Committee of the European Regions will do on the COP26. During these days, we are here both virtually, as I am now, but we also have an in-person delegation, and they will continue with the political advocacy on a global level on the grounds of evidence-based and scientific grounded arguments. Try to contributing to the discussions with local leaders, merge and unite our message to UN FCCC parties and national government, and we will try to spread the scientific knowledge at a subnational level, and to raise the ambition of the commitments for the local climate action by sharing experience and learn from each other. So we can go home and try to find additional climate action, because everything that we can do actually counts now. We cannot say just them over there that makes the big things that have to do something. We all have to contribute, and at the local and regional level, we had the knowledge of how to do it in our home and also how it works for our citizens. So also, I would like to say before I finish and wrap it up that we have to stress out that the links between gender equality
Yeah, I'll put it on here.
and science to deliver the best possible research and solutions for our citizens. And we need the youth empowerment to invest in higher education because the youth can contribute with new and innovative ideas. And I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you to all the speakers. We've got just on 10 minutes for the general Q&A before I hand over to Professor Volker, who will be closing the session. So having a look at the questions that have come in from the Q&A, there's one very specific question about the use of halophytes along the coast of Nigeria that's come from Hugh Pritchard at Kew. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask the Secretariat to capture that question and send it directly to Dr. Adubanjo, and he can answer Hugh's question about halophytes very specifically, please.
I've already typed the reply to Hughes.
So will you do that? Okay, thank you very much. But the other questions, I'll just raise them as because they have a similar theme, and they all tend to suggest that there's a lot of talking going on, but is anybody listening? So I think there's this degree of frustration that various activities are being planned and are being implemented, and there's this emphasis that we need science, and we need science in order to make policy decisions, but is anybody listening? So there was quite a strong comment coming from Caroline Hay that just said, we talk, are we going anywhere? There was another comment that came in and said, yes, it was nice to hear what all the academies are doing, from Norma Rom, but she also wanted to say, how do we actually monitor whether the academies are making any impact? If people come to the workshops and they go away from the workshops and nothing changes because they've attended an academy workshop or they've read a publication from the academy, what impact is academy actually having? So I think we heard very strongly earlier today from Guy Midgley that please listen to us. It was particularly about the reforestation issue, and I think that came across quite strongly. So now I'm just going to hand it over to you for a few minutes. How would you respond to these questions about, is it all a talk shop? And do academies and attendance academy functions actually make a difference? So I'm going to be specific then. I see Francois come back. Can I hand it over to Francois about, do you just think it's a talk shop, or have you found over the years people are listening?
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, that's such an important question to answer. Let us start at a global level. If we think for a start about climate science itself, we should realize that climate science has led to the Paris Agreement on climate change. 197 countries in the end listened to climate science and reach an agreement that potentially can slow down and eventually halt global warming, an existential threat to our way of life on the planet. However, I think we will also agree that that magnificent agreement was not converted into climate action since 2015. And today, once again, at COP26, humanity is once again facing this challenge. Can we convert climate science into action? So I think that the academies themselves, of course, play a critical role in coordinating, in assessments, bringing together vast bodies of science into critical reports. That is having an effect. And the IPCC assessments is yet another version of that process, and it had a tremendous effect in terms of the Paris Agreement on climate change. But that awareness has not yet. Awareness is not a winning recipe for action. That I think we've unfortunately also seen. So the big question is if the enhanced urgency around the climate crisis will now at least lead to action. And I think, you know, what we've seen in the first week of COP26 has certainly not all been negative. There are many, many positive things that have happened. New commitments about phasing out coal, transactions or deals in terms of support for developing countries in making the transition. I'm not referring specifically to the South African announcement of the Just Transition transaction. So I think we see for the very first time signs of action. I see that the new pledges may now take us to 1.8 degrees Celsius. That's roughly what's now emerging. But once again, everybody, those are pledges. That's not yet actual action. Maybe that's as far as I can take it, leaving this halfway hanging in the air, and maybe my colleagues can give a more definite ruling on this very tough question. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Francois. So I'll hand over this question for comment to Guy. And then in the last few minutes that we have, if I then may hand it over to the participants from the different academies, from the different parts of the world, to talk about in general, do academies make a difference, which is a bit of a crass way to put it, but I think that's the way some of the audience members are feeling. Over to you, Guy.
Yeah, I'd say that there's no question about that. The science has really led the way. Remember, it was only in 2007 that we were able to say unequivocally that there is you can detect a human imprint on the global climate. So just over 13 years ago, and we are now talking about pledges to entirely shift the global energy system away from coal. We've got pledges on methane, on deforestation. India has committed to net zero by 2070, which was one of those pledges that brought us below 2 degrees. For the first time, we have a path possibly to under 2 degrees with pledges. That hasn't happened before. So these are all enormous steps forward, and they're all informed by science. Without the models, the modelers were the ones who told us, well, we can now get below 2 degrees. That's based on science. That's based on the work of academies. So I don't think we should be shy about it. Science has driven this from the bottom up, and the politicians have had to listen. It's taken a while, but officially speaking, I think it's been pretty quick. And I think we've got to stop bashing the process. It's the only process we have. The US is back in the room. The US Senate is our enemy because of the Republican interests. And that's where we've got to fight this. So, let's stand together and continue on. And let also the economics work. The cost curves are now against coal and against fossil fuels. That's unstoppable.
So thanks, Guy. I had some messages coming through on my WhatsApp line on my phone saying, go for it, Guy. Tell them exactly what you think. So I think you did come across strongly. Thank you. So now over to the members of the academies. Would you like to make comments on what you believe you are good at? I see your hand, Himmler. And then Robin. Over to Himmler.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to all the colleagues for a really intriguing conversation. On the issue of how we move from a model of utility of coal to newer innovations that take us away from increasing on the carbon footprint. And as other speakers have mentioned, the recent announcement about the loan to South Africa to the tune of 131 million is significant. But I just wanted to add that ASAP has started a forum on the just transition. And this was even before this announcement. And the idea for that is there's also the human factor to be considered. In this country where we already face so many inequalities, how do we shift going from what is morally correct for us to do in terms of preserving the environment for future generations in lieu of what we've all heard about climate change, but at the same time, be aware of the sensitivities of how we cater to the masses of people who do work in the mining industry. How do we shift their skill sets from the utility of coal to the newer interventions? So that is a very, very big challenge for us. And I just wanted to say that ASAP, through the Just Transition, has put together a consortium of about 25 experts locally to start this conversation, and also to use the roadmap of all the other initiatives ongoing in the country, so that we as an academy can bring the conversations together, so that as a collective, we move in the right direction. Thank you, Mary, for allowing me to put this as another opportunity for our local academy. Thank you.
Thanks, Himla. Over to you, Robin.
Well, thank you. Yes, this is a hard question. I think we do all agree that science is helping to inform policy decisions, implementation, and changing practice. But of course, in terms of individual activities by academies, individual workshops and so on, it is very difficult to discern attribution. There are many other inputs. But I would just say that, of course, we heard from a politician in our workshop, Emma Noran in Sweden, who did testify to the importance in her world that science makes to politics. But I think hope I can speak for all academies in saying that we all struggle with the question about how do we monitor the impact of what we do. Let me just finish. I can't answer that, but let me just finish by saying that we're here in COP26. I think it would be fair to say that in previous COPs, there hasn't been so much discussion about health issues with regard to climate change. That is beginning to change. We are seeing health become more visible in some of the policy discussions about climate change. It is a health crisis as well as an environmental and economic crisis. And I do attribute that increasing visibility of health issues to work by the scientific and health communities over the last few years. And I hope that academies have helped to support that increasing visibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Robin. Jackie, I see your hand's gone down, but Emma's hand is still up. Emma, would you just like to come in for a few seconds, please?
Yes, sorry, may I? Thank you so much. It's very interesting discussion. And I think that we all know that the academies and the science are so crucial, but it's hard sometimes because we don't speak the same language. All scientists are trained for the whole life in scientific language and mindset, and politicians are often in another direction. So we need to find ways where we can meet together and try to do this. And I'm actually sharing the Swedish cross-party board on environmental issues. And as a chair, I'm just a facilitator. And we work on special environmental issues on behalf of the government, where we have politicians from all parties together with scientists and civil society to try to come up to the best solution. That's how we made up the Swedish climate law, which still I think is one of the strongest one, with carbon neutrality to 2045. And we have made a new policy for the marine life, and now we work on consumption-based carbon emissions. It takes time, but it's worth it. So we need to find these different areas which suit different levels and different countries. So we work together, because just publishing a report or saying something at an event usually don't make it the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. So may I hand over now to Professor Volker Tumuerlen, who has been in the Inter-Academy Partnership for many years, serving different roles as the co-chair on the steering committees, and now he's appointed as a special advisor. So I'm sorry, Professor Volker, we've cut your time a little bit short. So if we can try and be as brief as possible so that we can keep on track. So over to you, please, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mary. So I think we certainly can come to the conclusion that we had a very stimulating session with wide-ranging excellence of science, and we learned, I think, some important issues which will enlighten us and will help us in the future. But I think what I learned personally, then I could say that fundamental science and ecosystem science is something which has expressed by several speakers, which is important for analyzing the African situation in relation to climate change and impact. And also, I would say I learned personally that reforestation is not useful for Africa in certain area, which I would not have believed before I came to this meeting here. And that in 2013, it is also possible that Southern Africa could be entirely supported by renewable energy is something I think which is tremendously important, so that money should be provided for this, so that this can be done really to have an impact on climate change. I will not go into any further details of the meeting because this is time is short, but I would like to make a comment to the last question: how can we increase the impact of science and of academies by changing certain topics? And I think if we look back into the pandemic of COVID-19, and my background is pediatrics and virology, I can tell you that science has played a major role in overcoming this pandemic, in the development of vaccine, etc. But the academy certainly can do something important in each country where you have an academy, namely to inform the society. And for example, my academy, the Leopoldina in Germany, has had very close contact with politics, had advised politics, had helped, but still we have to recognize there's always a certain percentage in our population which will not accept it. And if you look into the vaccination success we have with COVID-19, it is obvious that there are about 20 to 30%, for example, in Germany, they don't want to be vaccinated, and in other countries as well. So if we come to climate change and our problems there, we will have the same thing. And I think what we have to do is to go into the society, tell the society facts, try to convince them. And with the increasing impact climate change will have, I think people will be more flexible, more open to understand, and will probably behave as we would like they should behave, so that we can really cope with the problem of climate change and health. So I would think we should not give up. We certainly should try to continue. And I can tell you from the IIP perspective that we had quite a success with another global project of food and nutrition security and agriculture, which we finished a few years ago, which was the basis for the UN Science Group to build on the experiences we had with these publications, where we made an update of our publication, when NASAC was an important part of it, playing in this discussion, which then on this, the United Nations built their advice to their food system discussion, which they had in September in New York in the United Nations. So I think there is success, but we have to go into contact, and I can only advise you that the African colleagues should make contact to the African Union, go to the African Union and discuss this right there, because there are major decision mates which will affect entire Africa. So I thank all colleagues for the fantastic presentation, the nice discussion we had, and I think we should continue and should not give up. We should leave this with an optimistic view and not with a pessimistic view. I think eventually we will change it, and we get there where we want to get. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Volker. So just in closing, I would just like to say thank you very much. When I teach my students, I say to them, if you don't learn something new every day and write it down, then you've wasted that day. So write it down so that you don't forget it. And I think I can quite happily sit for the next 20 minutes here and write down the new things I learned today from this session. So that's been extremely valuable to me. Thank you all very much. I think there's been strong messages about the importance of academies, the contribution they play to science advocacy, and the role that science is playing in changing the world and making our planet more sustainable. So thank you all very much. Thank you especially to Himmler for the South African Academy for hosting this particular event, and to all the speakers, and especially to the team who have made this event flawless. It's very unusual that a meeting like this going on across the world goes so smoothly without multiple glitches. So thank you all very much indeed. And to our participants.
Thank you, everybody.